The vote was already over. I knew it before Ambassador Chen Wei even opened his mouth. I could see it in the way the Vreth delegate, Councillor Savra Khan, sat back in his seat with that slow, satisfied lean, the kind a person does when they already know the game is won. He had his long fingers folded on the table in front of him, and he was not even watching the floor. He was watching us, the human section. 42 seats in a chamber built for thousands, tucked into the lower left quadrant like a footnote. My name is Mara Voss. I was 29 years old, a junior diplomatic attaché, and I had been inside the Grand Conclave of the Galactic Assembly for exactly 11 days. I had not slept properly in 6 of them. The chamber itself was unlike anything I had been prepared for. I had seen the photographs, of course. Every human diplomat had. But photographs did not carry the sound. The constant, layered hum of 10,000 translation devices running at once, each one converting speech into signals and signals into something the brain of the listener could understand. The air tasted faintly metallic. The seats curved upward in great sweeping arcs, tier after tier, until the upper galleries were so far above the floor that the delegates sitting there looked like dots. Species I had no names for sat up there, watching everything below with whatever sense organs they used for watching. I had a small screen embedded in my desk. It showed the live translation feed, the current speaker identification, and a running vote tally for Resolution 7 Sigma. That tally had not moved in 2 days. It sat at 247 in favor, with 9 abstentions and 1 opposed. 1. Us. Resolution 7 Sigma had been introduced by the Vreth Dominion 14 days ago. On paper, it was a piece of collective security legislation. It called for all member species to submit their full military records to an Assembly Oversight Committee, to agree to joint inspections of weapons systems, and to accept a binding limit on warship tonnage relative to the size of their population. Violations would result in sanctions, and repeated violations would result in what the document called coordinated response measures, which, when I had run it through the legal translation suite 3 times, came out meaning something very close to everyone else being allowed to come after you. I was not naive. I had been told before I left Earth that this resolution was not really about collective security. I had been told it was a message, dressed up in policy language. But sitting there in that chamber, watching Councillor Savra Khan look at our section like we were an inconvenience he was about to resolve, I understood it in a way that briefing documents cannot prepare you for. It was personal. They were afraid of us. Not afraid in the way you are afraid of something that might hurt you by accident. Afraid in the way you are afraid of something that has already decided what it wants, and is simply waiting for the right moment. The problem, from their perspective, was simple. Humans had been in space for 60 years. We had been members of the Galactic Assembly for 11. In those 60 years, we had done more damage to more things than most species had managed in 6 centuries. Not because we were cruel, not because we had set out to conquer anyone, but because we had spent the previous several thousand years on a single planet, fighting each other constantly, and in doing so, we had become extraordinarily good at it. We had developed weapons not because we dreamed of stars, but because our neighbors were always a threat. We had built warships not because we planned to cross the void, but because the oceans between our old nations had once been battlegrounds too. By the time we reached the stars, violence was not something we celebrated. Most of us hated it, but we were not going to pretend we had forgotten how it worked. The Assembly had been watching us since first contact. They had given us membership partly out of curiosity, and partly because the Keth, who had found us first, had vouched for our intentions. The Keth were calm, patient beings who communicated primarily through color shifts in their skin, and they had apparently decided, after 3 years of observation, that humans were chaotic but not malicious. Their endorsement carried weight. We got our 42 seats. But the Vreth Dominion had never been comfortable with that decision. The Vreth were old. Their civilization stretched back over 12,000 years by their own calendar. They had been members of the Assembly since before it had its current name. They moved slowly, spoke carefully, and had a political memory so long that they could cite precedents from events that happened before humanity had discovered agriculture. They were not wrong. Exactly. When they pointed out that our history was violent. They were not lying when they said our weapons were powerful. But they were using true things to make a false argument, and the rest of the assembly was too tired, or too cautious, or too inclined to defer to the Vreth's ancient authority to push back. Ambassador Chen Wei had been trying to push back for 11 days. He was 63 years old, a former professor of interstellar law, and he had spent the last 4 years of his life doing almost nothing, except learning how this assembly worked. He spoke 4 of the most common galactic languages well enough to be understood without a translator, which was apparently almost unheard of for a species as new as ours. The other delegates respected him, in the careful, formal way you respect someone you are about to outvote. I watched him now from my seat 2 rows back. He was reading something on his screen. His posture was controlled, but I had been watching him long enough to see the small signs. The way his left hand rested flat on the desk instead of relaxed. The way he blinked slowly, deliberately, at regular intervals, the way a person does when they are concentrating very hard on staying calm. The current speaker was a delegate from the Peluan consensus, a species that looked to human eyes like very tall, very thin gray pillars with no visible face. Their representative was reading a prepared statement in support of Resolution 7 Sigma. The translation feed on my screen rendered it in measured, careful language, but the meaning was clear enough. Humanity was dangerous. Humanity was unpredictable. The resolution was not punitive. It was practical. I sent a short message to Chen Wei's desk terminal. Just 3 words. What do we do? He did not look back at me. His reply came 12 seconds later. It said, "We listen." I looked around the chamber. The drawn delegation, seated 4 sections over, had been our second ally when we first arrived. They were small, fast-moving creatures with very large eyes, who had spent most of recorded history being pushed around by larger species, and had consequently developed a deep appreciation for the concept of the underdog. But 3 days ago, their senior delegate had come to Chen Wei privately and told him, with what appeared to be genuine regret, that the Drawn would be abstaining. The Vreth had offered them something. We did not know what. The Keth were still with us, formally, but I had seen their delegation huddled with Savrakan's people twice that morning, and the color patterns shifting across the Keth ambassador's skin had included several I had been taught to read as deep discomfort. They were not going to vote against us, but I was not sure they were going to do anything else for us either. The Peluan delegate finished. The assembly moderator, a tall insectoid being named something that the translation suite rendered as Arbitrator Veln, opened the floor for final statements before the formal vote. Chen Wei pressed the request to speak indicator on his desk. Arbitrator Veln acknowledged him. The assembly recognizes the delegate of the human nation collective, Earth. Chen Wei stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at his screen for exactly 1 second, then looked up at the chamber, at the tiers of alien eyes, the hundreds of species, the ancient, patient, enormous room that had been deciding the fates of civilizations since before our species had learned to write. He said quietly and clearly, "We have heard the concerns of our fellow member species. We understand them, and we want to be honest with this assembly about where we stand." He paused. The translation devices hummed. "We are not what you fear," he said. "But we are not going to pretend we are something we are not either. We did not reach the stars by being safe. We reached the stars by surviving everything that tried to stop us. You are asking us to hand over the record of that survival and accept a limit on our ability to protect ourselves. We cannot do that. Not because we distrust this assembly, but because we were not built to trust without reason, and we have not yet been given enough reason." Councillor Savrakan unfolded his fingers and began to speak before Chen Wei had fully sat down, which was apparently a breach of protocol significant enough that Arbitrator Veln had to call for order. The Vreth delegate waited with visible impatience, and when the floor was given to him, he said something that the translation suite rendered as, "The human delegate's remarks confirm our concern rather than alleviating it." The chamber murmured, different sounds from different species, but the overall effect was unmistakable. Agreement. I looked at the vote tally on my screen. It had not changed. It was not going to change. I looked at Chen Wei's back. He was sitting very still. And then, quietly, almost to himself, he said something that was not directed at any microphone, not meant for the translation feed, just said into the air in front of him, in a tone I recognized immediately. It was the tone of a decision being made. He said, "Enough." I did not understand yet what he meant. I would understand in the morning. That night, lying on the narrow bunk in my quarters aboard the human diplomatic vessel docked at the Assembly's orbital port, I pulled up a live feed of Earth. It was mid-afternoon in Lagos. The streets were busy. A market was open somewhere near the camera, and I could see the edge of a fruit stall, bright colors, people moving quickly with places to be. I watched it for a long time. Nobody on that street knew what was being decided about them tonight. Nobody knew that in a chamber on the far side of the galaxy, species who had existed for 10,000 years were deciding that humanity needed to be managed, contained, limited. I thought about my grandfather, who had been in 2 different armed conflicts before he was 30. He used to say that the most dangerous moment in any negotiation was when one side stopped believing the other side was negotiating in good faith. Once that happened, he said, you were not in a negotiation anymore. You were in something else entirely. I turned off the feed. I set my alarm for 5 in the morning. I did not sleep. At 6, a message arrived from Chen Wei to the entire delegation. It was short. It gave a time, a location aboard the ship, and 3 words that made my stomach drop, and my spine straighten at the same time. It said, "Dress for the floor." I was in the briefing room by 6:15. So was everyone else. Chen Wei stood at the front of the room. He looked at all of us for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Tomorrow morning, we are going back into that chamber. We are going to sit in our seats. We are going to listen to the vote. And then, we are going to leave." The room was silent. Someone near the back, I think it was one of the senior trade delegates, a man named Patrick Osei, who had been in diplomatic service for 20 years, said, quietly, "Leave as in walk out." "Leave as in walk out," Chen Wei confirmed. Patrick Osei said nothing else. None of us did. Chen Wei looked around the room one more time. "Get some rest," he said. "We have a long day tomorrow." I walked back to my bunk. The ship was quiet. Through the small porthole above my bed, I could see a sliver of the Assembly's orbital station, enormous, and lit up against the dark. I thought about what it would mean, what it would look like. 42 humans, standing up in the middle of the most powerful political body in the known galaxy, and walking away. I thought about whether it would work. I thought about my grandfather. I closed my eyes. I was ready. The morning of the vote, I woke up before my alarm. I lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of my bunk. There was a low vibration in the ship's hull that I had noticed my first night aboard, and never quite stopped noticing. The gentle hum of systems running, air cycling, power moving through conduits. It was the sound of something alive and functional. And in that moment, in the quiet before everything began, it was the most comforting thing I had ever heard. I got up. I showered. I put on the formal diplomatic uniform that had been hanging on the back of my door since I arrived. Dark gray, with the small blue and white insignia of Earth's United Diplomatic Corps on the left shoulder. I had worn it twice before, both times for ceremonial events where nothing important was decided. Today it felt different. Today it felt like something I was putting on for a reason. I ate in the ship's common room. Patrick Osei was already there, sitting with a cup of coffee and a data pad he was not reading. He was staring at the wall. When I sat down across from him, he looked up, and I could see that he had not slept at all. "You nervous?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded, like that was the right answer. "Good," he said. "Means you understand what we're doing." The delegation assembled in the docking corridor at 8, all 42 of us. I had seen this group in motion before. Meetings, briefings, corridor conversations. But I had never seen them like this. They were quiet, still. There was no nervous chatting, no checking of devices. People stood and waited. Chen Wei came down the corridor at 8 exactly. He was dressed the same as the rest of us. He did not make a speech. He just looked at the group, nodded once, and turned toward the dock. We followed him. The walk from the docking ring to the assembly chamber took 14 minutes. I had made it a dozen times. I knew every corridor, every turn, every section where the ceiling suddenly changed from the human standard panels of our dock to the older, stranger architecture of the assembly's permanent structure. Where our corridors were clean and utilitarian, the assembly's main halls were grand in a way that felt almost geological. Walls that curved in long, sweeping lines, ambient lighting that came from no single visible source, floors made of a dark material that reflected everything above it like still water. Other species moved through those corridors too. Most paid us no particular attention, but some stopped, some watched. A pair of Peluan delegates, the tall gray pillar beings from yesterday, turned their bodies slightly as we passed, which I understood from my briefing documents was their equivalent of staring. A small cluster of beings I did not recognize pressed themselves toward the wall to let us through, and I could not tell if it was courtesy or unease. I focused on the back of Chen Wei's head. He walked at a steady, unhurried pace, and I matched it, and the 42 of us moved through those ancient corridors like a single quiet thing. We reached the chamber entrance at 8:14. The assembly session was already open. Through the great doors, I could hear the background hum of the translation systems, the murmur of thousands of delegates, Arbitrator Veln's voice, translated and amplified, calling for order. Chen Wei stopped at the door. He did not look back at us. He just stood there for a moment, and in that moment I understood something that I had not fully understood until right then. He was not performing certainty. He was not putting on a face for our benefit. He was genuinely, quietly certain. He had made a decision, and he was at peace with it, and that peace was contagious, in a way that no speech or preparation could have been. He pushed open the door and walked in. We followed. The chamber was full. Every tier was occupied. Delegates from 263 member species, attending in person or by holographic projection, filled those curving rows from the floor to the highest gallery. As we entered and took our seats, I noticed that several nearby delegations shifted. Small movements, subtle realignments of bodies in seats, the way a group adjusts when something they were watching has changed. We were being watched. I sat in my assigned seat. Row 4, position 8, human section lower left. I placed my hands flat on the desk in front of me, the way Chen Wei had been doing all week, and I breathed slowly. Arbitrator Veln announced that the session was moving to the final vote on Resolution 7 Sigma. There would be one final opportunity for statements before the tally was cast. The vote itself would proceed by species, in alphabetical order per the Assembly's Standard Translation Index. 3 species made brief statements. All 3 were in support of the resolution. Their reasons were all different: security, precedent, resource allocation. But they arrived at the same place. Then Arbitrator Veln asked if any opposing voices wished to speak. Chen Wei pressed the indicator. "The Assembly recognizes the delegate of Earth," Arbitrator Veln said. Chen Wei stood. He did not look at his screen. He did not hold any notes. He looked at the chamber, at the tiers, at the faces, at the long ancient sweep of that enormous room, and he spoke. 11 years ago, he said, humanity was invited to join this assembly. We came gratefully. We came with our history, and our complexity, and our genuine desire to be part of something larger than ourselves. We have tried, in 11 years, to be good members. We have respected your protocols. We have honored your precedents. We have sat in these seats and listened to this body deliberate on questions that shape the lives of trillions of beings across hundreds of worlds. He paused. The chamber was completely still. Today you are asking us to accept a resolution that treats our existence as a problem to be managed. You are asking us to surrender our records, limit our ships, and submit to inspections, not because we have done anything wrong, but because of what we might do. Because of what our history suggests we are capable of, and I want to be honest with this assembly about my answer to that. Because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering in a moment like this. Another pause. I could hear the translation systems humming. "No," he said. "We will not." The murmur that moved through the chamber was like a wave. Different species expressed it differently. Sounds, color shifts, movement. But the effect was the same. The room was not sure it had heard correctly. Chen Wei continued, and his voice did not rise. It stayed exactly as calm as it had been from the first word. We did not travel across the void between stars to become less than what we are. We did not spend 100,000 years surviving on a dangerous planet, learning from every conflict and every failure, building our capacity to protect ourselves and each other, only to hand all of that to a committee that has never faced what we have faced. You have known peace for millennia. We respect that. We want to share it with you. But we will not pretend that peace is something we can afford to be naive about. We have learned what happens when you trust without reason. He looked directly at the Vreth section. We have heard your concerns about what humanity might do. I want you to hear ours. We are not afraid of you. We are not angry with you. But we are done asking you to understand us. Some things cannot be explained to people who have already decided what they think. He closed the datapad in front of him. Thank you for 11 years of membership, he said. We have learned a great deal. He sat down. The chamber erupted. I do not have another word for it. 263 delegations reacting simultaneously in their own ways produced a sound and a visual effect that was simply overwhelming. Arbitrator Veln was calling for order and not getting it. Councillor Sovreken was on his feet. 3 other senior delegates were trying to reach their speaker indicators at once. Chen Wei turned his head slightly and looked back at us. He nodded once. And then he stood up. Every single one of us stood with him. I do not know how to explain what happened in my body in that moment. I had not planned it. I do not think any of us had planned it. Not as a coordinated action, not as a rehearsed response. He stood, and we stood, and it was simply the only thing that made sense to do. We began to walk. Down the row, out of the human section, into the central aisle. Chen Wei at the front. 41 of us behind him. We did not run. We did not look at anyone. We walked at exactly the same pace we had used coming in. Steady and unhurried, like people with somewhere they needed to be. The chamber noise was extraordinary. I could feel it more than hear it. A full-body pressure of sound and chaos from every direction. Arbitrator Veln was calling for the human delegation to hold their positions. Councillor Sovreken was saying something that the translation feed on my earpiece rendered, after a half-second delay, as a demand that we be physically prevented from leaving. I did not see anyone move to do that. I do not think anyone was sure they had the authority. I do not think anyone was sure what was happening at all. We walked down the central aisle. The floor was that dark reflective material, and I could see the reflection of the chamber lights above us, and the small moving shapes of 42 humans beneath them. We passed the Keth section. I glanced over. Their lead ambassador, a being I had spoken with 3 times in 11 days, and who had always been kind to me in the careful, measured way of their people, was watching us with what I had learned to recognize as distress, a stillness of color that meant something between worry and grief. I looked away. We passed the Peluan section. The tall gray forms turned in their seats as one. We passed the outer ring delegations, hundreds of species I knew mostly from their file photographs, watching us move through their space like something they had no reference for. The great doors at the back of the chamber were ahead of us. 2 assembly attendants stood there, beings in the formal gray of the assembly's permanent staff. They looked at us, then at each other, then stepped aside. The doors opened. We walked through. Patrick O.C. was directly behind me. I could hear him breathing. I could feel the faint vibration of the door mechanism as it began to close. I was near the back of the group. I was almost through when something made me stop. I do not know why I did it. It was not planned. I just stopped, 1 step from the doorway, and turned around. The chamber was in chaos. Thousands of beings, hundreds of species, the ancient enormous room where the fates of civilizations had been decided for longer than humanity had been a civilization, all of it churning with noise and motion, and something that I could only describe, even now, as disbelief. For 1 second, a long and strange second that felt much longer than it was, I stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. Then I turned back, and I walked through the door. The corridor was quiet after that. Our footsteps on the dark floor, the distant hum of the ship waiting for us at the dock, Chen Wei's steady pace at the front, unchanged, unhurried. Nobody spoke. We did not need to. Behind us, I heard the great doors finish closing. The sound they made was soft, almost gentle, like something ending. 3 weeks after the walk, I was sitting in a small observation bay on the upper deck of our diplomatic vessel when Patrick O'Say found me. He had a tablet in one hand and a look on his face that I had come to recognize as his careful look, the one he wore when he had information he was not sure how to present. "You should see this," he said. He handed me the tablet. It was a translation summary from the Assembly's open broadcast channel, the public-facing feed they maintained for non-member species and independent monitors across the galaxy. The Assembly broadcast a lot of procedural content, agenda updates, and formal announcements, and most of it was as interesting as reading a government bulletin, but this particular summary was flagged priority by our monitoring team. It was a transcript of an emergency session that had been called 2 days after we left. I read it. The session had been called not to formalize our expulsion, which I had expected, but to discuss what our departure actually meant under Assembly law. The relevant statutes, as it turned out, were genuinely unclear on the subject. No member species had ever walked out of a vote in session before. The Vreth had argued for immediate suspension of Earth's membership status. Several other delegations had argued that suspension required a separate vote. A third faction had argued that we had effectively suspended ourselves and the question was moot. The session had lasted 9 hours and ended without resolution. "They don't know what to do with us," I said. "Nobody does," Patrick O'Say said. He sat down in the chair across from me. "We've had 17 contact requests in the last week. 12 from species who weren't even involved in the vote. 3 from Assembly staff. 1 from a private research collective I've never heard of. What do they want? Mostly information. Some of them are journalists, by whatever equivalent term applies. Some are academics. A few seem to be representatives of smaller species who weren't allowed to vote because they're not full members yet." He paused. 2 of them are from Vreth-aligned delegations. That surprised me enough that I looked up from the tablet. "They're asking questions," he said. "Privately. Not through official channels." "What kind of questions?" He took the tablet back and scrolled to a different section. "This one is from a staff analyst at the Peluan Consensus Secondary Office. She wants to know, and I'm reading directly here, whether humanity's departure represents a planned strategic maneuver or a genuine expression of principle." I thought about that. "Both," I said. "Tell her both." He smiled slightly. That's what Chen Wei said too. Chen Wei had been in contact with Earth daily since we left the chamber. The conversations were long, and I was not party to most of them, but I was in the room for 2, and what I observed was not crisis management. It looked more like planning. Calm, detailed, forward-looking planning, the kind that assumes the situation is not going to resolve quickly, and builds accordingly. Earth, from what I could tell, was not panicking. That surprised me more than anything else. I had expected, when I thought about it in those first few sleepless days, some form of political upheaval at home. Voices calling for a return to the Assembly on any terms. Voices calling for isolation. Instead, the reports filtering through to us described something quieter and more purposeful. Budget committees meeting, engineering teams being called together, colony ship schedules being accelerated, a commission being formed to review every independent research project that had been slowed or redirected because it duplicated work already being done by Assembly member species. We were not retreating. We were reorganizing. I thought about that a lot in those weeks, about how the rest of the galaxy had expected rage or panic or submission and had gotten none of those things. About how Counselor Savra Khan had leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a person who had won the game, and how he must be recalculating now, trying to work out what game we were actually playing. We were not playing a game. That was the thing they kept getting wrong about us. A message came in from a Thessi diplomat named Alara, someone I had spoken with briefly twice during my 11 days in the assembly. She was young for her species, which meant she was roughly 400 years old, and she had always spoken to me with a careful curiosity that I had found more tolerable than the pity or contempt I got from others. Her message was personal, sent to my individual address rather than through official channels. She wrote, "I have been thinking about what your ambassador said before you left. I have been thinking about it for 3 weeks and I cannot stop. He said that some things cannot be explained to people who have already decided what they think. I want you to know that I had not decided. I abstained from the vote not because I agreed with the resolution, but because I did not know what was right. I still do not know. But I am asking, if you are willing, tell me what you think we got wrong." I read the message 4 times. Then I wrote back. I wrote for 2 hours. I told her about my grandfather's wars, and what he had said about negotiating in good faith, and what he had said about the moment when you realize the other side is not negotiating at all. I told her about the street in Lagos that I had watched from my bunk the night before the vote, people moving through an ordinary afternoon, with no idea that a chamber full of ancient species was deciding their future. I told her that humanity was not violent because we enjoyed it. We were capable of violence because we had spent our entire history in an environment where not being capable of it meant being destroyed. I told her that there was a difference between a weapon and an intention, and that the assembly had looked at our weapons and assumed the intention without asking. I told her that the hardest thing about being human in the galaxy was not the size of the universe, or the strangeness of other species. It was knowing that everyone else had already made up their mind about us before we arrived. She replied the next day. Her reply was 3 sentences. "I think I understand," she wrote. "I think we were afraid of you before we ever met you. That is not your fault. But I am sorry for it." I saved that message. I still have it. Meanwhile, the assembly continued without us. Resolution 7 Sigma passed, obviously. It passed with 249 in favor and 14 abstentions, now that our single opposing vote was no longer in the room. It was entered into the official record. Announcements were made, documents were filed, and then, very quickly, it became clear that the resolution had a problem. The problem was that Resolution 7 Sigma had been designed with human compliance in mind. The oversight committee it established, the inspection protocols, the weapons registry, all of it assumed that the primary species to be monitored would cooperate with the process. Without our participation, the resolution applied only to species who had already been cooperating with the assembly for centuries and had no particular need to be monitored. The Vreth had built an elaborate structure to contain a specific thing, and the specific thing had simply not walked into the structure. Patrick Osei found me in the observation bay again 6 weeks after the walk. This time he was almost smiling. "You know what they're arguing about now?" he said. "Tell me." "The inspection committee can't agree on who to send first. Every species they were going to inspect is either already compliant or is now arguing that the resolution doesn't apply to them in the same way it applied to us. The Vreth are trying to expand the scope of the resolution to cover hypothetical future species, which apparently requires a whole separate vote, and they don't currently have the coalition numbers to pass it." I thought about Councillor Savra Khan and his folded fingers and his satisfied lean. "How long do they think this takes?" I asked. "Years," Patrick Osei said. "Maybe longer. Assembly legal processes don't move quickly." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, we are out here." He gestured at the viewport, at the dark and the stars, doing what we do. I looked at the stars. There were a lot of them. I had grown up on Earth, in a city, where the light pollution meant you could only see the brightest ones. Out here, away from any planet, away from any station, in the clean dark between systems, there were so many stars that they looked like something you could almost reach out and touch. I had been staring at them for weeks, every night when I could not sleep, which was most nights. They did not look frightening to me. They never had. That was, I was beginning to understand, the thing that frightened everyone else the most. 6 weeks after that, The first new project report came through from Earth. It was a colonization survey. 3 new systems that had been in planning stages for years had been formally authorized and were now in the early construction phase. Supply convoys were being assembled. Engineers were being recruited. Families were signing up. We were planting roots. More of them. Deeper. A second report came the next day. It was from a research team that had been working for 12 years on a faster-than-light communication system that would not depend on the assembly's relay network. They had made a breakthrough. They were not ready to publish yet, but the timeline had compressed significantly. We were not asking anyone for permission to do any of this. We did not need to. I was starting to understand what Chen Wei had meant when he had said we would make ourselves undeniable. Not through shows of strength, not through confrontation, simply by continuing to do what humans do when nobody is trying to manage them. We spread, we build, we learn, we adapt. We do it fast, and we do not stop. I wrote in my personal log most evenings. It was a habit I had started in the first week aboard the assembly station, a way of processing everything I was seeing and feeling in a form I could come back to later. The entries from the first 11 days were anxious and detailed, full of careful observations and barely controlled uncertainty. The entries from after the walk were different. They were calmer, not because things were simpler or safer, but because the uncertainty I had been living with since I arrived, the sense of being on trial, of every word and action being measured against a standard set by beings who had already decided their verdict, that uncertainty was gone. We were not on trial anymore. We had walked out of the courtroom. Whatever came next, it was ours to shape. I thought about that one evening as I sat in the observation bay, watching a distant star that I did not have a name for yet. Someone would name it eventually. Probably someone from Earth. I thought about Alara's 3 sentences. I think we were afraid of you before we ever met you. I thought about my grandfather, who had survived 2 conflicts and built a small farm on the edge of a city, and spent his last years growing tomatoes and telling stories about the things that had almost broken him and had not quite managed it. I thought about the people on that street in Lagos, moving through their afternoon, carrying groceries and talking on phones, and not knowing that the galaxy had been discussing them. They would know eventually. Everyone would know eventually. I hoped, when they found out, they would be proud of what Chen Wei had done, not because it was dramatic, not because it was defiant in some performative way, but because it was honest, because it was exactly who we were and what we believed, stated plainly in a room full of people who had not expected us to mean it. We meant it. We always meant it. Outside the viewport, the stars burned steady and cold and patient, the way stars do, in numbers too large to count, in a galaxy that was still learning what we were. We had time. We were not going anywhere. Except, of course, we were. We were going everywhere. That was the whole point. The transmission came in on a Tuesday. I remember the day specifically because I had just finished a long call with Earth's Colonial Affairs Office about resupply routing for the 3 new settlement projects. And I had eaten a late meal alone in the common room, and I was tired in the way you get tired after weeks of work that matters but does not resolve. I had my boots off, and a cup of something warm, that was not quite coffee, but was close enough, and my data pad was on the table in front of me, showing a map of the new settlement corridors. And then Patrick Osei walked in with the look. Not the careful look, a different one. "We have an incoming priority communication," he said. "Official channel. Encrypted. Assembly diplomatic designation." I sat up. "Which species?" "Vreth Dominion." I set down my cup. "Where's Chen Wei?" I asked. "Already in the communications room. He's asking for you." I put my boots back on. The communications room was a small, very clean space near the center of the ship, with a circular table and a holographic projection system that could render full-size avatars of whoever was on the other end of a transmission. Chen Wei was already seated, and 2 of the senior delegation staff were standing near the wall. The projection system was active, but displaying only the standard holding pattern. A slow, neutral rotation of the assembly's emblem, a shape that suggested an orbit without representing any specific planet. Chen Wei looked at me when I came in. "Sit," he said. "This is for you too." "What is it?" "I don't know yet. I wanted to receive it with the full senior staff." He looked at the projection. "Accept the connection." The holding pattern dissolved. The figure that appeared in the projection space was not Counselor Savra Khan. It was a younger Vreth, by which I mean it had fewer visible joint segments and moved with slightly less of the exaggerated deliberateness that the senior Vreth affected. It identified itself, in the translation feed, as Deputy Coordinator Veth Sarun, Special Liaison for External Relations. It said, "Ambassador Chen Wei, we are grateful for your willingness to receive this communication." Chen Wei's expression did not change. "We're listening." Veth Sarun said, "The Vreth Dominion is reaching out in a private capacity, separate from the formal assembly proceedings. We wish to discuss a matter of some urgency that relates to the stability of the current member species relationships." "Go ahead," Chen Wei said. "There is a situation developing in the Keth home system," Veth Sarun said. "A stellar event. The specific classification is beyond the scope of this communication, but the practical implication is that an evacuation advisory has been issued for the 3 inhabited Keth worlds in the primary system. The Assembly's Emergency Logistics Committee has been convened, but the current capacity projections for available transport are insufficient to complete an evacuation of the scope required in the time frame indicated." The room was completely quiet. I looked at Chen Wei. His face was completely still. "How many people are we talking about?" he asked. "Approximately 7 million Keth civilians across the 3 worlds. The highest priority window is 11 days. Chen Wei looked at me. Not at the projection. At me. I said, carefully. "And the Assembly's available transport capacity?" Veth Sarun was quiet for a moment. "Approximately 40% of what is required." "And you're contacting us," Chen Wei said slowly, "because..." Another pause from Veth Sarun. A longer one. "Because the human logistics network has the capacity to fill the gap. Your colonial supply infrastructure, your transport vessels, your coordination capability." The Vreth deputy's voice carried something I had not heard from any Vreth in 11 months of observation. Not quite humility, but the absence of the usual certainty. "We are aware of the diplomatic circumstances. We are asking regardless." Chen Wei looked at the table in front of him for a long moment. "Give us the system coordinates," he said. "Give us the stellar event data. Give us the civilian population distribution across the 3 worlds and the current Keth government contact points." Veth Sarun said, "You're agreeing to help." "We're agreeing to look at the problem," Chen Wei said. "We'll tell you in 4 hours whether we can do what you're describing." The connection ended. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then one of the senior staff, a logistics specialist named Diane Archer, who had been with the delegation since before I joined, said very quietly, "We can do it." "I know," Chen Wei said. "Then why 4 hours?" He looked at her. "Because I want to look at the data myself. And because some things deserve more than a snap answer, even when the answer is obvious." He stood up. "Mara, get me everything we have on Keth population distribution and the current state of our colonial transport fleet." I was already moving. The next 4 hours were the most focused I had ever been. Diane Archer and I worked side by side with the logistics team, pulling data, running projections, calculating transit times and loading capacities and fuel reserves, and the specific requirements of evacuating Keth civilians, who were small and fast-moving, and had particular environmental needs related to atmospheric pressure and temperature that would require modification to some of our standard transport configurations. It was solvable. It was difficult and complex, and it required resources and coordination on a scale we had not previously attempted. But it was solvable. Every calculation we ran came back to the same answer. We could do it. We could do it, and have a safety margin. At the 4-hour mark, Chen Wei reconnected with Veth Sarun. "We can do it," he said. "We're sending you the deployment plan now. First vessels can be in transit within 18 hours. Vethsarun said something that the translation feed took a moment to process. When it came through, it rendered as, "The Vreth Dominion is grateful. We did not expect this." Chenwei said, "We know." He closed the connection. 18 hours later, 12 human transport vessels departed for the Keth system. I was aboard the fourth one, a large cargo-converted ship that had been modified overnight to carry the environmental configurations Keth civilians required. It was not comfortable work. The modifications were rough and functional rather than elegant, and the life support rerouting had required 2 of the engineering team to work through the night without rest. But it worked. We arrived at the Keth system to find the situation worse than the initial data had suggested. The stellar event had accelerated. The time frame had compressed from 11 days to 8. The Assembly's advance vessels were already on station, doing what they could, but the gap between what was needed and what was available was exactly as large as the Vreth data had projected. We went to work. I have tried, in the years since, to explain what those 8 days were like. The only honest answer is that they were not dramatic in the way that most dramatic things are. There were no speeches. There were no grand moments of decision. There was just work, continuous and specific and exhausting. The kind of work that does not allow you to think about anything except the next task in front of you. My job was coordination, maintaining communication between our vessels, the assembly ships, the Keth government emergency teams, and the civilian processing centers that had been set up on the surface of the 2 outer worlds. I slept in 4-hour segments when I could, ate whatever was available, and spent the rest of the time on communication channels that were sometimes so crowded with overlapping transmissions that the translation system struggled to keep up. The Keth were, in that period, extraordinary. Their species communicated through color, and in ordinary circumstances, those color shifts were subtle and contained. In the evacuation, surrounded by millions of people and the stress of leaving their world behind, the visual effect was overwhelming. Whole crowds shifting through the same emotional palette simultaneously, entire processing centers lit in waves of the pale yellow-green that their translation guides identified as collective anxiety, shifting to a deeper blue when they reached the ships and the loading began. It meant something, that color. It was not metaphorical. It was direct, immediate, visible emotion shared between beings who did not need words for it. I watched it from the loading bay of our ship, on the 3rd day, as the first major group boarded. 742 Keth civilians, age range from very young to very old, carrying whatever they had been able to bring. They moved quickly and quietly, trusting the process in a way that I found almost unbearable to watch. And as they passed the human crew members managing the boarding, several of them touched, briefly, with the flat of their color-shifting palms, the hands of the humans nearest them. It was the Keth equivalent of thank you. Our crew members held very still and received it. On the 5th day, I received a transmission from Elara, the Thessi diplomat I had been corresponding with since the walk. She wrote, "I am watching the news feeds from the Keth system. I want you to know that everyone is watching, not just the assembly. Independent monitors, non-member species, private citizens across hundreds of worlds. What you are doing is being seen." I wrote back, "We're just doing what needs doing." She wrote back immediately, "That is exactly what everyone is watching." On the 8th day, the last Keth civilian was loaded. 7,042,000, and some hundreds more. The final count varying slightly depending on which registration system you used. All of them off the 3 worlds before the stellar event reached full intensity. The worlds themselves were not destroyed. The event was disruptive, rather than catastrophic. But they would be uninhabitable for years, and the evacuation had been necessary, and it had worked. The Assembly's official emergency committee lead, a being from the Peluan consensus, named something that translated approximately as Coordinator Sev, sent a formal acknowledgement to our fleet commander. It was written in the formal diplomatic register, careful and correct, and it said that the Assembly recognized the contribution of human transport assets to the successful completion of the Keth evacuation. Chenwei read it once and filed it. Then he sent a personal message to the Keth government emergency contact he had been working with throughout the operation. The message was not in the formal register. It was direct and simple. It said, "Your people are safe. We're glad we could help. Take care of each other." The Keth response came back 4 hours later, in color pattern notation that our translation system converted to the nearest text equivalent. It was not a perfect translation, the notes said. Color language always lost something in conversion. But the closest rendering was, "We will not forget you." 6 months after the Keth evacuation, the Assembly convened a special session. I was not inside the chamber this time. I watched on a broadcast feed from our ship, which was docked at a different station, a human-operated waypoint facility in a system 3 jumps from the Assembly's home station. We had built it ourselves, in the months after the walk, as part of the infrastructure expansion that had been running steadily since Earth reorganized its priorities. The session was to vote on whether to invite humanity to resume its membership in the Assembly. I watched it with Patrick Osei and Diane Archer and 12 other members of the delegation who happened to be on station that day. We sat in the common room with the feed on the large display and mugs of various beverages, and a silence that was comfortable rather than tense. The silence of people who have been through something together and do not need to perform their reactions for each other. The vote was 251 in favor of the invitation, 8 abstentions, 4 opposed. Even the 4 Vreth bloc delegations that voted against did so without any of the confident theater that had characterized Councillor Savra Khan's presentation of Resolution 7 Sigma more than a year ago. They voted no quietly, as if they already knew it did not matter. Arbitrator Veln formally announced the result and stated that an official invitation would be transmitted to Earth's unified diplomatic corps. Patrick Osei looked at me. "Well," he said. "Well," I agreed. We waited 3 days to respond. The response, when it came, was drafted by Chen Wei, with input from Earth's diplomatic council. I was in the room when the final version was approved. It was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph thanked the Assembly for the invitation and acknowledged the significance of the vote. The second paragraph said that humanity would return to the Assembly as a full member, effective on a date to be determined by mutual agreement, and that we looked forward to continuing the work of building a galaxy worth living in. It did not apologize for the walk. It did not reference Resolution 7 Sigma. It did not explain or justify or seek validation for anything we had done. It just said, "We're coming back. On our own terms." I recorded a personal log entry that evening, sitting in the observation bay, looking at the stars as I always did when I needed to think. I talked about the walk, about what it had felt like to stand in that doorway and look back at the chamber. All those eyes, all that ancient accumulated certainty, all of it looking at us with something between horror and confusion. I talked about Ilara's message, and the Keth boarding the ships, and the color they turned when they felt safe. I talked about what Patrick Osei had said on the morning of the vote, that being nervous meant you understood what you were doing. I talked about my grandfather. He had told me once, very late at night, when I was much younger, and we were sitting outside his farmhouse watching the stars, that the greatest mistake a person could make in a difficult situation was to let someone else decide what they were worth. He had said it in the context of something very small and personal, a dispute with a neighbor over a property line that had gone on for 2 years, and I had not understood at the time what he really meant. I had understood it as being about that specific dispute. I understood now that it was not about the dispute at all. It was about the principle underneath it. Nobody gets to decide what you are worth. Not your history, not their fear, not a room full of ancient species who had made up their minds before you ever walked through the door. You decide that. And then you walk in, or walk out, or walk somewhere else entirely, and you do it on your own terms, and you do it without apology, and if they want to understand you, they will have to come and ask. They had asked. We were going back. I closed my log and sat for a while longer, watching the stars. They were as numerous as always, as unchanged, as patient. The galaxy was full of them, and full of the civilizations orbiting them. and full of the long, complicated history of all those civilizations trying to figure out how to exist alongside each other. We were part of that now. We had been part of it for 12 years, and we were going to be part of it for a very long time. I thought about the new settlements being built, the faster-than-light communication research that was nearly complete, the colony ships moving through the dark with their cargo of people and seeds and equipment and everything else a species carries when it goes somewhere new. All of it moving, all of it growing, all of it entirely outside the Assembly's jurisdiction and entirely within our own. We had not needed them to become more than we were. But we were going back, because the galaxy was a big and complicated place, and being part of a community, even a complicated and sometimes frightened and sometimes wrong community, was worth something, was worth the work, was worth the patience, was worth the walk. I looked at the stars for a long time. Then I went to bed. In the morning, I had a meeting with Chen Wei about the return schedule. There was a great deal to organize. 42 seats to reclaim. Protocols to review. The careful, specific work of re-engaging a political body that had changed, in small ways, during the year we had been outside it. I was ready for all of it. Outside the viewport, the stars burned on, steady and cold and indifferent, in a galaxy that was finally, slowly, beginning to understand what we were. We were the species that had come from a single world, alone and stubborn and full of history, and crossed the void between stars with all of that still intact. We were the ones who had stood up in the middle of the oldest room in the known galaxy, and walked out without permission. We were the ones who had come back when someone needed us. We were the ones who would keep coming back. Because that was who we were, and we were not going to apologize for it. Not ever.